Hey everybody, welcome to the Unintelligible Afterlife presented by Bryn Athyn College. My name is Curtis Childs. I'm going to be your host. I'm with the nonprofit Swedenborg Foundation, and the Swedenborg Foundation is partnering with Bryn Athyn College to stream this out on the internet. So everybody who's watching online, hello, or whatever camera you're on. Everybody who's here, hi, thanks for coming. Excited? Okay. It's my job to get that going. Don't worry, I'm not one of the speakers. So, a little housekeeping stuff before we start. Cell phones, I know you're probably not going to turn them off, but you could put them on vibrate. Airplane mode would be great. And then if you see this coming towards you at the intermission, don't panic. This is for, you were handed 2 cards when you came in. One of them is a donation. If you're so moved, you can fill that out, make a donation which will support the research that they're doing. And then the other one is a question card, because we're going to have the presentations, then there's going to be a short intermission, and then we're going to come back and sit down and we're going to answer some of your questions. So if you have something that comes up during the show you want to know more about, or you want to hear something we didn't cover, get those in and we'll try to do that. So don't worry, they'll be passed out during a video, so you'll have plenty of time to react. So to begin, the feel of the night, I was thinking about how things become more precious when there's a limited supply of them. You know, that happens with art, or it can happen with materials or that kind of thing. But it can also happen with words. When we think about the people you love, and sometimes it can seem like they have an endless supply of words. But if you started to realize that I'm not going to get to hear this person talk that many more times, doesn't that bring a new potency to those words? Don't we want to grab onto them and know what they mean and understand where they're coming from? I was thinking about when my grandfather was dying, he couldn't talk anymore, but he could write. And so he would write down, people would ask him something, he would write it down. And so I got to read those. It was before I was born, but I got to sort of read what his last words were. And some of this stuff that he wrote was really clear and really hopeful, but other things he wrote was really cryptic. And what did he mean by that? And if we could figure out what he was trying to say there, not only would we know more about him as a person, but we'd know about the place he was in, right? I mean, the position he was in, that's somewhere we're all going to be someday. And so is he from there, from the edge of the end of life, trying to give us some kind of hope or instruction, about what's going on? So that's what we're trying to look into tonight. Research into the communications of the dying is the research project which is seeking to explore the last words of those who are approaching death. The scientific protocol has been created with an interdisciplinary team in mind, from philosophy to medicine to linguistics to psychology and spirituality. They are seeking to record, translate, or transcribe, analyze, and categorize the language of the dying, not only to help the people who are dying, but clinical care providers and loved ones address the process of dying with more understanding and less fear. So thanks for being a part of this tonight. And what we're trying to do is take the structure of scientific inquiry and place that alongside and intertwined with the emotional potency of these questions around love and the end of life. So, if you're ready, we're going to get started.
My father said these simple words before passing. Well then, goodbye.
I need my pearls for the big dance tonight.
My mom said, I'm trying to get out of
big
this cage.
storm is
I'm trying to get
down
out
the
of this
rabbit
cage.
hole.
I'm talking to your father. She asked me to bring her best dress and shoes to the hospital.
Tell everyone that I am okay.
Just before dying, he opened his eyes, looked towards the heavens, and smiled broadly. I'm too happy. I had never before heard him use the word too like that.
Thank you very much for being here. And what I'm here for tonight is to introduce you to what I regard anyway as a very important clinical study that I think will, just from my clinical experience, I think will be very valuable to the families of the terminally ill and also for clinicians who treat them. And want to say also at the beginning, which I always do, is that I am known, of course, for the near-death experience and so on. And what I constantly hear about this is that people say, oh, scientific proof of an afterlife and so on. And I have always said in my career, no way. I am not a parapsychologist. And in my opinion, at least in 2015, scientific inquiry is just not yet set up to investigate a question of an afterlife. Okay? For one reason, for those of you who are into science and so on, will understand that the sentence there is life after death is not falsifiable. Right? You can't think of any observation that if you could make it would show you that the sentence is false. So we're in a different category of study here, and to me, the question of life after death is, I think, and having been convinced of this by Plato, that it is probably the biggest question of human existence. And it is still a philosophical question, and a very profound one, and not yet a scientific question. And you may wonder, what in the world does the notion of unintelligibility have to do with this? So I want to start by reading something to her, reciting something to you that, unless Pennsylvania is different from most of the other parts of the country, many of you will recognize. One bright day in the middle of the night, two dead boys got up to fight. Back to back they faced each other, drew their swords and shot each other. A blind man came to see the fray. A dumb man came to shout hooray. A deaf policeman heard the noise and came and killed those two dead boys. How many of you remember that playground rhyme from your childhood? Let me look around. Oh yeah, a lot of people. So it's in Pennsylvania too. This goes way, way back. It's a playground rhyme. And what I want to do is to point out some things about it. One is that it's deliberate nonsense. It's a nonsense poem. It's a volley of self-contradictions. Right? But nonetheless, that as you hear those lines, it brings a very vivid story alive in your mind, right? You see the images and so on. So as Alice said in Alice in Wonderland, she's about the poem Jabberwocky, she said, well, it's very pretty, and it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are. So nonsense, as Plato very beautifully pointed out, even though it's unintelligible, brings vivid images to our mind. Secondly, I can assure you from decades of dealing with this subject that playground rhyme brings many very poignant and touching memories alive in people's minds who remember this as a kid. And also that it was very often coupled, as other nonsensical playground rhymes were with physical activity, typically tossing a ball around to the rhythm of the poem. And which shows, incidentally, that nonsense has a role, which we can demonstrate in many other contexts too, in social bonding, that it can be a social bonding experience. Also, it's associated with various magical practices. A few years ago in Aspen, a Colorado businessman told me that he was talking about that poem, and he said when he was a kid, every time he would walk by the graveyard near his home, he would recite that poem as a sort of magical protection. Again, what does this have to do with question of the afterlife? Well, not being a person who ever had any religious background, the only way I have to think about this notion of an afterlife is in terms of reason. And the question arises, is there a rational proof or rational pathway to getting some sort of credence to the notion of the afterlife? And in my experience, everybody that I know who really looks at this not from the point of view of wanting to make it be true, but rather just to try to figure out what is, which is what I'm interested in, when they think of this question of the rational investigation of the afterlife, they come up against the difficulty that David Hume, one of my favorite philosophers, 1711 to 1776, so beautifully put. And if you listen to this and try to follow along the thoughts as I read this, you'll see what he's talking about. By the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. By what arguments or analogies can we prove any state of existence which no one ever saw and which no way resembles any that ever was seen? Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind, that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And what he's getting at there is that in terms of classical logic, the sentence, "there is life after death," is a self-contradiction, because if you look up the words in the dictionary, death just means the final irreversible cessation of life. So the sentence translates to, "there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life," which may seem rather trivial and petty, but if the genuine problem is the rational investigation of the afterlife, it becomes a major difficulty. So, what I need to do now is to give you a little brief thumbnail sketch of the history of logic, which is one of the most fascinating stories of history. But we get it up to Plato, and Plato was the very first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative domain of language. And also, they had, about 100 years before Plato, they had, Parmenides had articulated the notion of truth. That is, truth is that which is the case independently of what anybody thinks about it. And for that reason, Parmenides is called the father of deduction. But about 100 years later, Plato was thinking of it, and he thought, just a minute here. We know that there are some sentences that are the case no matter what anybody thinks, and that's the quality of truth. But he said, so also there are these other sentences that are not the case no matter what anybody thinks about it, and that he defined as falsehood. And in formulating the true-false distinction, he linked it with the literal domain of language. And that's why we say today the literal truth. Okay? Now, meanwhile, Plato was also aware that this other domain of language, the nonsensical or the unintelligible, was also very important. And in his dialogue on this, makes some very brilliant observations about nonsense. In the next generation, his wonderful pupil Aristotle was, to characterize Aristotle, he must have been pretty severely obsessional, as you can tell from reading his will. And he was, anything that smacked of a rationality to him was like this. So when he articulated the logic that we're using in everyday life, he predicated it on the literal domain of language and the true-false distinction. And his favorite word for nonsense was random talk. So he eliminated this strain that had been in Platonism. One thing I think we can see very quickly is that nonsense is not random talk. As a matter of fact, nonsense is less random than ordinary meaningful language. I know it sounds paradoxical, but basically, how should I put this? Well, that's too technical. Let me go on with this other way of putting it. I think most people kind of think of nonsense as, if you think of this as the level of ordinary meaningful language, people think of nonsense as something down here that is sublinguistic. But that is not correct. In fact, nonsense is something that accrues on top of ordinary meaningful language. It's called a supervenient form of language. So it's more complex than ordinary meaningful language. Now, what are we talking about here? Let me start with the definition of nonsense. And the common sense view of what nonsense is all distorted. But if you want to go to the dictionary, you'll see that this is what it means. Nonsense is, number one, language. When the kid is misbehaving and running in a circle or something, stop your nonsense, where we're referring to non-linguistic behavior, that is a secondary sense that's derivative. In primary sense, nonsense is language. Okay? But language which is unintelligible, that is, it conveys nothing clear to the mind and the intellect can't comprehend it. But you know, when you're listening to TV and there's that 404 on the 911 or something, and they say, well, that's there is unintelligible. That's unintelligible because the transmission got mixed up, right? So nonsense is language that is unintelligible because it is meaningless, and that's what it means. And one trouble we are really deeply into in all of the West is some popular misconceptions about nonsense, which are all demonstrably false. Number one, people think that nonsense is something intrinsically bad and undesirable. It's a term of disapprobation, right? And yet, people have an adverse response to the notion or to the word nonsense, but they love actual nonsense. And it's a part of a lot of things. For example, for those of you who might have been raised in the 50s will remember doo-wop music, right? Sha-na-na-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na-na, get a job, where the mixture of the nonsensical and the intelligible elements are the essence. If you will look up in the dictionary, that's what doo-wop means. It has a nonsense as the main line or the harmony. Okay, so in reality, nonsense is part of humor, it's part of song, it's part of playground rhymes, children's literature. So it's a very positive part of life in reality. Secondly, people think of nonsense as something like nothingness or non-existence and chaos. They think of it as the absence of something. But that's just a grammatical illusion based on the non in the beginning. In fact, as I said, nonsense is a more complex layer of language than ordinary meaningful language. Thirdly, and this is the worst of the four common misconceptions about nonsense, to think that nonsense is the same as falsehood. A lot of people unthinkingly use it that way, but that's just not correct. The true-false distinction is one thing, and nonsense is a different thing, and nonsense is not a form of falsehood. And it's not going to be fatal if you fail to distinguish between nonsense and falsehood, but it will certainly get you into trouble in various kinds of abstruse areas of inquiry. I met this wonderful man a few years ago who is teaches an Air Force colonel who is a professor of analysis at the CIA, and he was talking with me about my work, and he said, you know, it's very important for our agents, he told me, to understand the difference between nonsense and falsehood. So it may seem trivial or abstract or whatever, but in the real world of inquiry, it's a very important distinction to make. And because of all these misconceptions, people think of nonsense as something unknowable, unfathomable, and utterly beyond the reach of logic and reason. Well, that's not true either, because we do now have ways of investigating this very complex problem. And because of these four misassumptions that are so deeply embedded in ordinary thought, as I can show, I'm sorry, I got to apologize here in a way. I'm trying to condense something that is ordinarily for me a full semester length course that I teach to philosophy students and psychology students, and a lot of attorneys take it, and literary professors come a lot too. So, but I know this is going to sound crazy, but you know, at 71, that's all right. You know, But because of these misconceptions, there is a sort of collective cognitive flaw that is inbuilt in all of us. We learn these sort of misconceptions early in life, and they complicate our ability to reason logically when a sentence may appear to be meaningful, but on the depth level it's unintelligible. And if we try to apply Aristotelian logic to that, our minds go berserk. So it's a collective cognitive deficit that we can actually correct. Now, what if we're trying to talk about nonsense and somebody says, well, you say that's nonsense, but I say it makes sense to me. How do we handle that? Well, we need a criterion for selecting actual examples of nonsense. And there's a very simple way to do this, and that's to distinguish between deliberate nonsense and involuntary nonsense. Deliberate nonsense, written by such people as one of my favorites, Dr. Seuss, that you see there. Incidentally, I read in the New York Times a few weeks ago that Dr. Seuss has sold 600 million books. And this is pretty amazing. And my wife said, well, you've bought 1 million of them yourself. So deliberate nonsense, if the writer engineers it and writes it to be nonsensical, we can accept that it is. But there's another domain of language, of nonsense, the involuntary. And as any medical doctor here could assure us, that people talk nonsense involuntarily all the time when they are delirious, or when they are intoxicated, for example, with mercury or nitrous oxide, or just when they are under stress. I mean, I guess probably everybody who's ever worked in an emergency room has had the experience a patient who's severely injured in an accident comes in, but then their companion who was in the accident but was uninjured, no problem at all. And so you're trying to get a straight story from this uninjured person, and it's all, it doesn't make any sense, right? You can't. So stress will make us talk nonsense involuntarily. Now, at this point, you say, well, if you're going to base your examples, as I am, entirely on deliberate nonsense, because we can be sure of it, then you're excluding a whole side of it, the involuntary. But guess what? I've learned in my medical career, which anybody can verify, that when patients talk nonsense involuntarily, they talk nonsense of identically the same pattern that nonsense writers come up to amuse us. So there is something, nonsense has its own structure that is independent of whether we produce it deliberately or involuntarily. And this gentleman down here is obviously probably demented or Alzheimer's, and again, many of you know that your Alzheimer's relatives sometimes lapse into nonsensical talking. Well, in my investigation, I've just for many years been a great lover of nonsense writers. Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll was one of my favorites when I was a kid. Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein, for those of you who know him. There's a lot of wonderful nonsense writers. And you're just going to have to take my word for this one, although you could confirm it for yourself if you read a lot of nonsense works, that lo and behold, nonsense, which because of these misconceptions we think of as an undifferentiated unitary phenomenon, actually is a very complex phenomenon with many, many different types. As a matter of fact, in my investigation of nonsense, which goes back in a way to when I was a kid, I have identified over 70 different types of nonsense. And incidentally, I and also other friends of mine who is investigating this from a psychological point of view have thought that each one of those types of nonsense has its own identifiable and describable effects on the mind. Wish I had more time to go into detail, but this is rather astonishing, some of the effects of nonsense on the mind. So I've said here that there's 70 plus different types, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through 70 types, but I'll give you some examples of nonsense. And I'm going to talk about 3 different types here, okay, which you can plainly see are different types. The shiny phlasuma, easily tubuled 5 sorbic glusters away. That's one, right? But now listen to this one. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. Or, listen to this one. That cannibal we just ate was the last one around these parts. Now, I'm assuming that you would all agree that those are all nonsense, but that you can hear the difference in the types, right? So much so that if I said to you, a smiling square root repeated the electric limp of potatoes, you would be able to recognize that as an example of the second type I gave, right? Or if I said, I'm not an actor, but I play one on television, you would recognize that as an example of the third type. Or if I said, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, you would recognize that as an example of the first type. Okay. Now, one thing that we quickly get into complications when you're trying to put order into this thing is that, let's see, I'll go back a minute on that one. Nonsense can be modeled on absolutely any form of ordinary meaningful language. For example, I can take the format of a definition and I can write nonsense that looks like a definition. Or I could focus nonsense around pronouns, for example, and listen to this. This is, they told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free exactly as we were, right? Now that's an example of nonsense that's formulated around pronouns, because we can understand pronouns very well, but there has to be some way to establish the referent of the pronoun, and that's what Carroll undermines here, so it's nonsense. We could do it with conjunctions, we could do it with all kinds of things, but most significantly for the kind of thing that we are talking about here, I need to point out that even when you take a certain format of language and you lay nonsense down on the layer of it, to layer on top of it, you nonetheless have a sense of that form of language. Now, that's abstract, but let me give you an example. When I was in high school, I was 8th grade, and I read this biography of Lincoln by Carl Sandburg. I think that was where I read this story. But when Lincoln was president, and I forgot the occasion, but it was a very solemn state occasion, and everybody was gathered around, and his part in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to lead the procession away from the scene. But in the event, when he got up on the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was jumping around, and everybody shocked into silence. Oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, it's so embarrassing for the president. So Lincoln looked down at the horse and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you've got to agree it's nonsense, but that nonetheless, right, it brings a very vivid image to your mind of that very motion, right? This is a favorite technique of nonsense writers, is to take the format of a travel narrative and lay a layer of nonsense down on it, and you can feel that sense of motion in your mind. Listen to this one, a 19th century nonsense poem. Why and wherefore set out one day to hunt for a wild negation? They agreed to meet at a cool retreat on the point of interrogation. But the night was dark and they missed their mark, and driven well nigh to distraction, they lost their ways in a murky maze of utter abstruse abstraction, and so on. Now, I've been monitoring the effects of that poem on my students since 1969, and I can tell you the normal response is people say that even though they know full well that that's nonsense, that it nonetheless gives them a sense of motion in their mind. Okay? Now, all of this nonsense, the many types, nonetheless have a single universal structural principle in common. And that is that all types of nonsense have the following structure in common: that they respect some rules of language, but they violate other rules of language so that the sum or the outcome of it is unintelligible. And let me give you just one example. We could go through all the types, but for example, when I say, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe," is that a grammatically correct English sentence? Yes, it's grammatically correct. All the adjectives and nouns are in proper order. And also it has some made up words in it that don't mean anything, but let me ask you this. Brillig and 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Do they sound like Russian words? No. Do they sound like Polish words or Portuguese words or no. Do they sound like English words? Yes. So this type of nonsense uses the phonetic structure of ordinary, meaningful English words and makes up nonsense around them. And it puts them in a grammatically correct format. And the grammatically correct format enables you to say, even though the word is meaningless, what part of speech it is. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves." What part of speech is slithy? Adjective, right? So that is the structural formula, as I said, that underlies all nonsense. Now, to bring this to a close here, because, we have a lot of folks to get through now, I want to point out that one thing we can realize once we start thinking about nonsense in a systematic way, it's a very simple way of showing that when the mind switches from one state of existence or framework of existence to some other incompatible framework of existence, then the mind necessarily generates nonsense in that transition. This here is a picture by Escher. It's one of his drawings. And I just put this one up here, which is a good example of it, but is the general principle of all of these things is the same, that he drew impossible geometry, right? And maybe the one that most are familiar with was the one of the water wheel. The water is coming off the mill chute and it goes over the wheel. And then you follow the water and it goes down one trough, and then it turns an angle, goes down the other, then another angle, goes down the other, then another angle, it goes down the other, and then it's right back at the top of the wheel, okay? So one thing this shows us, if you took a protractor and a ruler and what graphic artists call a value scale, you could create a perfectly intelligible and meaningful description of this as a two-dimensional surface. You could say that angle, that line there is 7 inches long. It goes off of this line at a 43-degree angle, and so on. And the value scale is what artists use to evaluate all the shades from bright white to complete black. And you could do it. It would be a complicated task, but you could do it. But if you try to describe the scene in the drawing, it's nonsense. That the water goes down, 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 and then it's up, where it started. So what this indicates to me is that if somebody, let's say by hypothesis, were to go to some other dimension of existence, take a trip to another realm of existence, and came back, then when they came back and tried to put it into words, they would be forced to talk nonsense about it. So what this indicates to me is it's a very critical thing whether we can put credence on near-death experiences or not depends on, are they literally nonsensical? And if they are, then we're in trouble, because that's an indicator in my mind that the person didn't go to another realm of existence. So the question is, do near-death experience narratives, are they nonsense? And my answer is yes, because it's a type of nonsense we just discussed. Because, the presupposition with a near-death experience is that people say there are no words, and it wasn't in time, it was a timeless experience, and it wasn't in space. And yet, how do they synthesize all these things to try to describe it to us? They say, I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, I met my deceased relatives, I saw my life pass in review, I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But we grasp the meaning of travel narratives because of the concepts of space and time. So we're dealing here with a nonsensical travel narrative, which sounds shocking in the light of these common misconceptions about nonsense. But if you take the real deal about nonsense and realize that this is a very important and essential domain of human expression, then you get to realize that, this is a good thing, because now we're safe at least this far. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I am not a parapsychologist, and in my opinion, in 2015, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question, but it is still a very important philosophical question and maybe the most important one. And so I think that rational principles of nonsense, which we now have, as I mentioned, this book of mine on it is being published in France in December, but not yet here. So it's obviously I'm at a disadvantage here in terms of getting all the salient points here across. But what I would say is that this opens up two genuinely rational ways or pathways to getting elucidation on this question of an afterlife that are not yet, which is not yet a scientific question, but nonetheless I think we can make inroads on it. And an experience I had as a young medical doctor was, because I went into medicine already with this interest in nonsense and the different patterns and so on. And what I quickly realized was that, as I said, when people talk nonsense involuntarily, like because of delirium or psychosis or whatever, the nonsense they talk has identically the same patterns of nonsense that deliberate writers come up with. So that there's an inherent structure there that we can investigate. And one of the things I quickly realized in my work with terminally ill patients was that it's a very common thing. I've seen this just repeatedly. I see it all the time, where people will tell you, yeah, in the last few days, my husband was alive. This is a religious studies professor I talked with a few years ago. It's the last few days my husband was alive, he was talking nonsense, and I knew it was nonsense, she said. But somehow, in the back of my mind, I thought it was important. I kind of understood. Now, let me show you something here. In all honesty, how many people here know of this from your own personal experience with dying relatives? And if you could just hold your hands up for a minute. Look at those hands. Just look around. This is a very common clinical problem or issue which is not addressed because we tend to just brush aside nonsense, right? And it's people say, oh, it's the drugs. That is not the drugs, because we had a lot of terminally ill patients that we didn't have on drugs at all. They were not medicated, but nonetheless they had the same experience. This is something somehow built into us. It will be a very, very important thing for us to investigate the kinds of enigmatic utterances that people come up with in the last few days of life, because we've seen right here this is important and memorable to people. But now we have a way of investigating it. So the idea is to record the nonsense and other modes of language, the enigmatic, figurative and nonsensical modes of language that the dying instinctively resort to, and now with a typology of nonsense and a very adequate catalog of the psychological dimension of it, the effects on cognition and emotion of nonsense, we will be able to get a clear analysis of this phenomenon for the first time. It's always been of interest to people. You know, how many anthologies have you seen at the bookstore on the last words? And that's a literary genre of last words, but it's not very accurate as to what really is going on, because people won't remember the nonsensical parts of it. They will remember something that's easy to memorize. I was recently reading about Goethe, and his last days famously said, mehr Licht, more light. And so I was reading about that, and that's just almost a watchword. I was reading about that a few months back, and it said, one of the persons said, the last intelligible thing Goethe said was mehr Licht, implying that there were other things that they didn't pick up on, and that's just a very common phenomenon. I think we have the real opportunity now to change this from a literary genre, which is important in itself, but it's always predicated on eminent men, like famous people. And it's always ones that are sort of pre-selected to root out the ones that you didn't like or something. Now we have a real way to look at this. Is this related to life after death? I don't know. But I think that this is a genuine opening to a rigorously rational way to look at the question, because sorry folks, I'm not having a stroke or anything. There's just me. It's like for years, even back in medical school, they were saying, oh, Raymond, you got Asperger's syndrome. And then all of my psychiatry friends, my wife, my kids' language instructor. And I said, oh, it's just a fad. But then a few years ago in New York Times, I read about Asperger's syndrome and all that. Oh, yeah, that's me. So I guess I can work logic problems, but I can't tie a tie and fumble with things. But so if there is some sort of transition during the dying process from this domain to some other, then that would be an example, right, of the cross-dimensional nonsense. And there are markers for this that we would be able to tell if somebody during the dying process flips over into another state of existence that would show up in the language. But I want to reemphasize that is not the object of this study. The object of this study is, for clinical reasons, to help clinicians and especially to help the families and to understand the dying process. What goes on in the dying mind? If you think about it, that universal structural formula of nonsense, that it violates some rules of language but respects others, that is a backhanded way into the mind of the dying person. We want to know what sort of rules of language is it that they respect in this process and which one is it that they abrogate. So I think that we just have a really interesting opportunity here to delve into a very important dimension of the human mind. And in this, I had been wanting to do this kind of study for a long time. I thought it was very important. But, you know, at 71, I got 2 kids. It's too much work. And, you know, I mean, as much as I'd like to do it, I just didn't have the energy to get all this together. And I was talking about this 4 years ago at a university. And so this talked about my ideas, and a very wonderfully nice woman named Lisa Smartt bounced up, and she said that she was a graduate in linguistics from the University of California, which is, by the way, the best linguistics school in the country, and that the reason she was coming to this lecture, which was partly about near-death experiences, was that her father had died how long before? 2 weeks? About 3 months before. And that as a linguist, what was most puzzling to her was that she knew that he was talking nonsense. Incidentally, he's a very famous poet, but that he, and also a clinical psychologist, but she knew he was talking nonsense. She was very puzzled about this. So she, in her grief, she came to my lecture to talk about near-death experience. She heard me talking about this, and oh my God. So she quickly volunteered, I want to do my doctoral dissertation on this, and came a couple of months later with all these amazing things figured out, and now she is starting this, I think, is going to be a very important study. You know, throughout my life, I've just been interested in knowing what is, and I've investigated all sorts of things that are off the beaten path. And one thing I realized that with what I call the nonsense taboo, which is not just a factor in America, but it's all over the world where I've been, is the same thing. People look at nonsense negatively rather than positively, as they should. And so I know this sounds crazy and, you know, counterintuitive, all these things, but hey, I'm really great at extrapolation. All my life I've been able to extrapolate. Watch this. Let's go 5 years forward. I conjecture, I project that in 5 years, what now sounds so bizarre and outrageous and, you know, just kind of offensive in a way, that in another 5 years, people are going to be looking at this and say, yes. This is something, it's one of those things that got sort of muffed in the ancient thought and has been carried forward. But now we have entirely new ways to look at it. We can see nonsense as a domain of language that is completely continuous with the literal and the figurative and exists and is defined in relation to the very same rules and conventions that define ordinary, meaningful, literal, and figurative language. So, like I said, I confidently project that we're on the verge of something here that's going to tell us a lot of interest to know about the human mind and how it copes with the dying process and what the transition is like. So I am just very happy and honored. And I'm 71, I'm past the age of politeness, folks. You know, I just say what I think, and I am honestly, deeply honored that, you know, that you would be open, and thank you all, folks, and willing to wade out into the unknown. And it looks already, from what I'm hearing of the research, it's very consistent with what I've heard over the years, that we're seeing some remarkable patterns in these utterances of the dying. So, again, it's always great to be here. I first came here in '77. I have such wonderful memories of this place, and thank you very much for having me.
few days before my grandmother died, she said to my aunts and uncles, "Can I go home now?"
This is a remarkable moment for me. I was a special ed teacher for most of my career, and then my father passed away. I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be standing in front of a room full of people. I've never stood in front of this many people in my life. And following the wonderful, kind, and generous, and brilliant Raymond Moody. Thank you all for being here. As I said, I have never done this before. I've never stood in front of this many people to share something this dear to my heart. My knees are shaking, my heart is racing. I've never done this before. Did the slide change? I think I'm just going to say, change slide. Whew. These are the same words my father said when his editor Alice asked him a few days before he died, "How you doing, Morty?" And he said, "This is very interesting, Alice. I've never done this before." As a linguist, I was very intrigued by these words. I've never done this before. What was this my father was speaking about? Was it that dying was such a terrifying and incomprehensible concept that he couldn't even use the words, "Dying is very interesting, Alice. I've never died before"? Or was it that his experience was so ineffable, so beyond words, that it left him only with the word "this," a non-referential pronoun of "this" without any point of reference for me as a listener, or for him perhaps as the speaker? These words and all the words my father spoke in the last 3 weeks as he died were remarkable to me. And being trained in linguistics, it was second nature for me to write down every word I heard, capturing all the utterances without judgment and with respect for the beautiful potency and complexity of language, for the legacy my dear father was leaving. And as I transcribed my father's final words during his last weeks of life, it was as if I were entering a new and foreign territory. I was witnessing something remarkable. His language was changing in startling ways. And as it was changing, his consciousness appeared to be changing too. Next slide. Joe, thank you. A few months before my father died, this picture was taken. "I'm just a visitor, just visiting the planet," he told our friend who took the photo. It was as if he knew he would be dying soon, although at that time there was no indications that death was near. And I've heard now that I've been doing this research that that's not uncommon. Many times people have a premonition of some kind before they die. It was as if he knew he'd be dying, I beg your pardon, but while he joked about being a visitor to this planet, in truth, my father did not feel he would be returning anywhere. He did not believe there was another home. He did not believe in God or any higher power of any kind. He told me many times, "There is nothing beyond this world. This is it." Matter of fact, when people asked him about his relationship to God and Judaism, he would say, "I'm a gastronomical Jew. I pray with my stomach. My God is a corned beef on rye and coleslaw on the side. Drinking cream soda is my divine sacrament." He was a PhD psychologist and believed in nothing beyond the power of the mind and this five-sense world we live in. Wait, there was one thing, and that was my mother. For 56 years, my father believed in her. Next slide, please. My mother was an artist, and during the 5 decades they were married, my father would carry boxes for her to all her art exhibitions. And that is why this sentence, "I'm bringing these boxes to the big art exhibition for my wife's art show," had particular poignancy. On January 25th, 2012, while my mother was sleeping, my otherwise lucid, highly intelligent father walked out the front door at midnight in his underwear and wandered onto one of the busiest streets in our hometown. No Alzheimer's, no indication, no difficulty before that. When the police asked what he was doing there, he said, "Oh, I'm bringing these boxes," there were no boxes, "to the big art exhibition for my wife's art show." Shaking their heads in pity, the police officers took my cold and shivering father to the hospital, and that was when my mother received the call. My father at the time was undergoing routine treatment for prostate cancer and had just started a new medication. So we thought at the time that his mixed up crazy words were just the medications talking. However, as I have learned through my years of research now, it's very common for people in the days or weeks before dying to announce that a major event is coming by using a metaphor like my father's of the art show, a momentous moment metaphor. And the metaphors people use are often associated with the things that matter most to them in their lives, like carrying boxes to art exhibitions for a man who deeply loved his wife. And we know from the work of Callanan and Kelly, they have a marvelous book called Final Gifts, and other healthcare providers and researchers, that the use of these momentous moment metaphors seem to cut across medications and illnesses. The effects of meds on the language of end of life is something we are going to research more fully in our upcoming study here at Bryn Athyn College. Let's take a look at my father's final words, representative, I believe, in final words in general, though at the time I didn't know that. All righty, next slide. There is so much so in sorrow. This is technically nonsense. I mean, does sorrow have so-ness in it? Technically, no. But it felt like I understood the meaning. It was like he was saying, there's so much sorrow in me, there's so much so. And the grammar of the sentence is correct, right? There is so much so in sorrow. But it's nonsense. Next one, please. My father was a gambler, cigar-chomping, gastronomical Jew who loved to gamble. So there he was this was maybe 2 weeks before he passed on, and when you're packing for Las Vegas, Susan, better bring the oxygen tent. Well, one of the things we know, it's very common that as people are in their final days, they start talking about metaphors of travel, making references to travel of all kinds. Next, please. I can't reach Jack. My modality is broken. Jack was a friend of his who had passed away a few years earlier. Was he trying to reach him? Once again, the grammar is correct, but the meanings are unusual. Modality sounds to me like modem. In English, one of the central metaphors we use when we talk about the mind is machine. George Lakoff looks at the prominent metaphors, and that's one of the prominent metaphors. So I've found already there's a lot of breaking, I'm out of order, things are not functioning kind of metaphors. And we'll be researching this particular. All right, next one. Now, this is the one that stunned me the most. My father, I talked about angels in my life, and my father would roll his eyes and chomp on that cigar. So you gotta be kidding, kid. So I was sitting there with him. My father had always teased me and even kindly questioned my spiritual beliefs. But one afternoon, a few weeks before he died, he held my hands as he was sleeping. And then his eyes popped open, and he looked up at the corner of the ceiling, then turned to me and said, "Lisa, you were right about the angels." Next one, please. Okay. So this, again, is technically nonsense. Something is going on here, right? Paradoxical phrases are another relatively common construction in final words. And if we didn't analyze it, if we didn't take nonsense seriously, we would just let this go by. But as we're looking at the language of those who are dying, we're seeing this pattern of these kinds of self-contradictions and paradoxical speech. And what's interesting is we find paradoxical speech in the language of people who have had near-death experiences and return. People say things like, "I've never felt so alive as when I was dead," right? It's paradoxical. Or, "Yes, my near-death experience, it felt like it took a minute, but also 1,000 years," right? Paradox. Okay, next slide, please. There are so many people here, I don't have time to talk with all these people. There were no people there from what I saw. Here was another case that there was no reference point for me as a listener. I did not see many people in the room. Non-referential nonsense. What people? And this too is very common. The dying very often see people in the room with them, and often predeceased friends and relatives or spiritual figures. But technically, in the 5 sense reality, it's nonsense. Next, please. The angel said, "Enough. That's it. Enough. No one's to blame. Go now. Enough. 3 days left." The repetition here is also very common in end-of-life speech, as is a premonition that turned out to be absolutely correct. 3 days later, he did pass on. And my father was speaking to angels. Wow. Next, please. "Hurry up. Get me down, please." Raymond was talking about this idea of the nonsense travel narrative. And here again, here's my father lying confined to bed, but he's talking about getting down and hurrying up. So very common at end of speech to see change in the prepositions and hear about people's movement. And finally, "Thank you. I love you," were the last words he spoke to my mother. Okay. Alrighty, next slide, please. Oh, there's something missing there. One of the things that I noticed, and maybe all of you noticed also, is that in that language there were a lot of metaphors and nonsense. Many, many, many more than we would find in regular, healthy, spoken language. Is that an accident? Or is there maybe something we haven't yet explored? And that's part of what we hope to answer. Next slide, please. Once I noticed my father's language and I was interested in what I saw, I graduated from Berkeley and I went to the library there to look for answers to my questions. Surely there was going to be hundreds of journal articles about end-of-life language and use of metaphors and nonsense, but there was almost nothing. I just couldn't believe it. And I was gripped by curiosity. I wanted to know more. Why did we see changes in the language as people die? So the first thing I asked myself is, what do we know about language that might help me answer the questions? Well, how's time? I just want to make sure that I respect everybody else's time. Okay. So what we know, next slide. We know there's many kinds of language, but tonight we're going to talk about literal language. And literal language is like the stone. We all know what a stone is. We'd all agree with what a stone is. One-to-one meaning correspondence to the five senses and all of our reality. But then you might say, he has a heart of stone. That is metaphorical language, and that is when we use objective five-sense reality to help us explain more subjective, less concrete things like cruelty and meanness. We could say he's mean, but saying his heart is like a stone offers all of us a touch point. We all share the same definition of a stone, but maybe different ideas of meanness. Okay. And then when it comes to nonsensical language, that has little relationship to the five-sense reality we all share. The stones with their zippered mouths are chatting. Nonsense has little connection to the reality we all know and love. It is a language of complete disorientation and has multiple meanings. So those are the different types of language, but here is where it gets really interesting to me. In the early research with brain scans, what they're finding is that when people are speaking literal language, the left hemisphere is engaged, right? And that has to do with the analytical thought and reasoning. However, when people start speaking metaphorically, guess what? There's an engagement of left and right brain hemispheres, okay? But what happens when people are speaking, what happens when people are speaking nonsense? Suddenly you see the engagement of the right hemisphere, which is traditionally associated with music and mystical and transcendental states. Next one, please. There are pieces of my PowerPoints that disappeared. Yes. So the question is did the changes I see in my father's language somehow track changes in consciousness? Next one, please. Are the changes associated with changes in the brain as we die? Are we wired for transcendental experience at end of life? So if our language reflects changes in predominance in terms of what parts of the brain we're using, is it possible that we are wired for more mystical transcendental experience? So I'm really short, even with my heels on. And the monitor I was going to use for the rest of my presentation, I can't see it. So what should I do, do you think? So, whoops. How's that?
That's great.
You all can hear me? Thanks. So as I started to see these changes, I wanted to know more. And that was when I took the seminar with Raymond Moody, and I could not believe that he was talking about unintelligible language. And I was very touched by the fact that not only did he have depth of experience with a near-death experience, but he understood language in a way that really amazed me. So I started studying with Raymond. I actually moved from California to Georgia so I could work with him and learn more from him, which was one of the best decisions in my life. And just a year ago, I established the Final Words Project. And the aims of the Final Words Project is to research final words with the same attentiveness we bring to researching first words. If you look in the databases, there's tons of stuff on language acquisitions in the early part of life, but almost nothing on final words. I also wanted to move past the nonsense taboo to a systematic study of unintelligible language. And I wanted to study the language of near-death experience to see how it might relate to the language of the dying. And these are all things that I've been doing just in the last year and a half to 2 years. Alrighty, next slide. So what I'm going to do is just give you some examples of, this is very early research, very early findings. I'm just going to show you a little bit of what I've discovered in the language of people in their final days. Alrighty, next. Callanan and Kelly were two nurses, and they wrote a beautiful book that was very anecdotal about the metaphoric language of those people at the end of life. And we are going to build upon their anecdotes to a more systematic study of this topic. Next one, please. So do we die as we live? Perhaps. The metaphors, symbols, and nonsense of final words are often rooted in the personality and lifetime narrative of the person dying. Quote, this came from one of my participants. My dad had been a roofing contractor and carpenter during his life. At my father's bedside, when he was dying, he would awaken and look over me and smile so big. And he told me they had all these kitchenettes over there. There were miles and miles of them, he said, and he would be helping to build them. He certainly was having an amazing time during his passing away, judging from the smile and excited look on his face when he would wake up. Pretty remarkable, I think. A few more examples. Jeffrey Holder, I don't know if anyone knows, the dancer, he passed away recently, and his son explained that the very final words were arms 2, 3, 4, turn 2, 3, 4, swing 2, 3, 4, down 2, 3, 4. This one I just received last week from a PhD student at UGA. I can't go, there isn't a drummer. His daughter, heaven's sending their best drummer, Papa. I hear him. I hear him. I can go now. Whew, pretty remarkable language to me. And it's amazing to me that these stories haven't been told yet. Or they have of the famous, but not of just the ordinary poets. My father said, I see interim spaces of poems. Jack Spicer, my vocabulary did this to me. Nonsense, right? One of the things that I've found so far is that the image of foursomes in poker and golf, there's a lot of golf going on as people are in their final days talking about they're going to make a fourth. You know, there are these three golfers, and usually they might be predeceased friends or relatives, and then they're like, yeah, they're calling for me to be the fourth. Next slide, please. They're telling me I need to come and sit down beside them and smoke and drink, and I just think I'd rather stay here in my chair, right like this. But they tell me now I have no choice. I got to play in the big poker game. Guess I'm just going to have to join them. One very common theme, too, is the big dance or the big dinner. My mother asked me to bring her best dress and shoes to the hospital because she was attending a grand ball that night and would be so happy to see me there. Another person similar. She woke up in the middle of the night and started getting dressed in a long gown that was in the back of her closet. She was sitting at her dressing table, putting on jewelry and makeup. Nana said, I'm getting ready for the big dance. She then lay down and died. Next, please. Very common so far, again, very early part of the research here, but reference to the weather and changes. The tide is turning. The reservoirs are filling. The storm is coming. Do you think the rain is coming? Next, please. Very common to see metaphors of leaving, as I'd mentioned with my dad in the oxygen tank going off to Las Vegas. Euphemism of death as a journey is almost universal in languages around the world. The suitcase is packed, I have to go. The car is packed, where are the keys? Jetta, I need to get my Jetta. You hear that plane going over? Is that coming okay? That is the coming of day. The trolley is near. And one of the things I've noticed so far, and again it's very early, is that so far I haven't heard anyone say, get my sneakers. I'm traveling over. No, but everyone seems to have outside agency, that a trolley comes, a car. However, in the stories of near-death experiencers, of course, they have their own agency as they're moving. But in that transitional state, people seem to talk about outside agency. And then when people have near-death experiences, suddenly they seem to have their agency back. They're actually walking down the tunnel or moving through the tunnel. Again, a lot of language about goodbye. Well then, goodbye. I'm ready to leave now. I think I will go now. They are coming for me now. Next slide, please. This is a term I learned from Raymond, epizeuxis, which is repetition, and it's much more common in the speech of the dying than in that should be healthy living speech. It also appears as in incantations, meditation, and the language of mystics. It's all in one piece, it's all in one piece, it's all in one piece. What you see in different pieces, it's all in one piece. Oh, more worlds and worlds, so profound and powerful. Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. Steve Jobs, that's a well-known one. It's time to get up, get up, get up. So why would there be more repetition in those final days? We don't know yet, but it looks to us that definitely that's the case. Next. So different types of nonsense. Let's just go to them. Next slide, please. One of the nurses I interviewed who was from Trinidad said that in his country, the nurses describe the nonsense that people speak before they die traveling, which I thought was interesting. Next, please. Prepositional nonsense, as you saw in my father's language, things about moving in space. I want to pull those down to earth somewhere. I don't really know. No more earth binding. Help me down the rabbit hole. Hurry up, get me down, please. I've got to get down to earth. Help me. No, wait a minute. You are one stop from real hope, which means one stop from real hope. I am living between two places. Would like to make my place mark the other place. Remarkable. Next slide, please. Paradoxical nonsense, which I mentioned before. Could you persuade the staff to grant me half a full measure? Introductory offer, store is closing, you saw that earlier. I don't think there is progress in winning and losing again. Okay. Next. Non-referential, again, we mentioned that before, where we don't know what or to whom the person is referring. It's very interesting, Alice. It's very beautiful over there. Too bad I cannot tell you all of this. It's all a hoax. It's not what you think. It's all an illusion. Next, please. And again, what we see, people referring to people that we do not see with our five senses. There are so many people in here. Don't you see him there? There he is. Here's Mom, I have to go. My father died on a Friday morning. He spent the entire Wednesday before that talking sometimes out loud and sometimes muttering under his breath to a whole variety of people he had known throughout his life. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. Next, please. Hybrid, for now I'm calling them hybrids, but what's so interesting is there'll be one part that's grounded in this world and then another part that seems to be grounded somewhere else. Get me my checkbook since I have to pay at the gate. Truly. I need my pearls for the dance tonight. Help me down the rabbit hole. Please massage my feet so I can get down the rabbit hole. Okay, one foot in this world, one foot in the other. Get my camera. I need to take a picture of this. They left the ladders, but the ladders are too short to go up there. Someone had ladders outside the window, and the person was referring to that. Where are my glasses and computer? I have to get to work. Next, please. Finally, categorical. Just what mentioned before, Raymond mentioned, these sentences are grammatical, but they don't always, quote, make sense, right? My modality is broken. There is so much so in sorrow. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kiln. That's from Dutch Schultz. Anyway, let's pass. Let's go to the next slide. Let's take a time. So nonsense is an important part of the language of NDEs and end of life. And from early findings, there appear to be clear patterns in the types of nonsense across medications and diagnoses. Next. 80%, and Kenneth Ring, who is a researcher, in his research with blind participants who had NDEs, they claim to be able to see during their NDEs or OBEs. His book, Mind Sight, is a remarkable book. These findings from researcher Kenneth Ring are complete nonsense in relationship to what we know about literal five senses, reality, and language. The blind man saw, right? Next one, please. A quote from one of those participants, I know I could see and I was supposed to be blind. I know I could see everything. It was very clear when I was out. I could see details in everything. So one of my questions is, are we talking about nonsense or a new sense? One more slide, please. Nonsense is neither true nor false, but new truths emerge from it, from Raymond Moody. The study of nonsense at end of life may offer us a pathway to understand a new, maybe transcendental, sense that exists after death. And my final slide. We're in the very infancy of this inquiry, and I feel incredibly honored to be part of it. And I will be working with Dr. Erica Goldblatt, Hyatt. I hope to do research into the communications of the dying with the loving guidance and wise guidance of Dr. Raymond Moody. Thank you all so much for sharing this really amazing moment.
My mother whispered at the very end, oh, more worlds and worlds. So profound, so powerful.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and welcome again, everyone, to this presentation. Well, Raymond and Lisa have provided some theoretical and philosophical underpinnings as well as personal motivation for our research study. I'm going to provide you with an overview of this incredible, groundbreaking research. Today, I'm going to tell you a bit about why I've chosen to get involved in this research and bring it right here to Bryn Athyn College, what we are intending to do with it, exactly how, methodologically, we are going to do it, and what our next steps will be. I'd like to begin with a personal note and tell a tale I've often told since assuming my position at Bryn Athyn College. I was only 8 years old when I developed an awareness of the fact that we don't live, at least not in our bodies, forever. And from that first appreciation of the limitations of our physical lives, I became fascinated, terrified, and enchanted by the idea of death. As an 8-year-old, I didn't have many tools under my belt except for the power of language, so I spent much of my time penning disaster novels with intriguing names like Black Plague, Tornado, and Earthquake, creating lovable and intriguing characters who all died in the end. I was grappling, you see, with the concept of personality and trying to understand how could people so full of life vanish. I knew that I wanted to study death and be close to it for my life's work, and took that step professionally, first as a social worker in pediatric and adult oncology units, abiding with the dying, but later working with survivors of post-traumatic stress disorder, helping veterans, gang members, and women and children who experienced domestic abuse tell their stories. Later in my career, I transitioned into administration and became director of admissions for a psychiatric unit in a large hospital in Washington, D.C. I was drawn to help people who experienced death in other ways. Death of healthy, fully functioning minds, death of family support, and death of the dream of who they might have become had mental illness not intervened. When I met my husband and told him of my morbid fascination with mortality, he immediately introduced me to the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who wrote extensively on the afterlife. For me, after those early years in pediatric oncology, it was the tender depictions of what happens to children in heaven that caused me to explore this unique perspective more fully and ultimately apply for a job here at Bryn Athyn College, where the great Dr. Sonia Werner had just established a psychology major. I was grateful she saw potential in me, and today I follow in her immense footsteps, working on a curriculum to integrate psychology and spirituality. I'm proud to say that with the help of my colleagues, not only do we now have a review board through the Holy Redeemer Health System that has agreed to examine our research proposals with human subjects, but I also chair a committee here that helps faculty determine when such a review board might be necessary so that they too can pursue human subjects research. I've also authored a book that just came out September 1st, a self-help guide for teens who have lost a brother or sister. This work is the result of my dissertation from the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm a 3-time graduate, and is available for you here tonight. So I've been busy. I mentioned that Dr. Werner and I have endeavored to create a curriculum here at Bryn Athyn College that integrates psychology and spirituality. More and more, academics in my field are beginning to appreciate the value that spirituality has to offer we humans as we attempt to live happier, healthier lives and make meaning from our experiences. Psychology and spirituality appreciates that feeling connected to specific religious doctrines, as well as broader spiritual approaches or practices, can help people live healthier, longer, and more connected lives. This area of study includes an exploration of things like near-death experiences and how they affect people's worldviews, but also conversion, glossolalia or speaking in tongues, meditation, the effect of prayer, and more. It's a huge and fascinating area of research. And it's a perfect one for Bryn Athyn College, positioned in a Swedenborgian community where followers of the writers of Swedenborg welcome all religious perspectives and are open to different beliefs about the afterlife. Swedenborg was himself a scientist and very much believed in the empirical exploration of processes seen and unseen. Our spiritual psychology program honors that perspective, that living a spiritual life and feeling connected to other people and forces outside oneself, as well as pursuing a life of charity, truly does lead to well-being. We therefore support and promote research with outcomes that help people live fuller, more meaningful lives. I was looking for a unique research project to help enhance our mission, as well as continue to explore and better understand the process of dying, when I heard about the Final Words Project, and through the amazing medium of Facebook, that also introduced me to my husband, I became acquainted with the great Lisa Smartt. I was intrigued by her proposition that the words of the dying might mean more than the living can appreciate. As a clinician working at the end of life, I witnessed unintelligibility in many ways, and not always in the realm of spoken language. For example, I frequently reflected upon the death of a young girl under my supervision now many years ago. The process of her death, while devastatingly sad, was fairly common to those familiar with hospital bedsides. She was no longer conscious, and she was hooked up to machines that breathed for her and kept her heart moving. But as her body failed, the machines recorded in various beeps and alarms that she was dying. As I silently, wordlessly watched the process, I was struck by the unintelligibility of the noise before me. I suppose I was struck by the sounds in the room that were there, and all that was before me in the dying process that was wordless and yet full of speech at the same time. I could pinpoint the moment the patient left her body, despite her body looking the same as it had for many days, unresponsive and surrounded by the music of the intensive care unit. Her transition was silent, but I understood in wordless language. It makes no sense when I tried to capture it, so it was unintelligible. But she was there, and then she was gone. But not gone, going elsewhere. And if I thought too much about it with the words I use in my daily life, I missed the whole thing, unintelligible. Still later, when I worked with dissociative patients, people who split off from this reality when their triggers of their trauma became too overwhelming, there was a sense of them being both here and not here. And sometimes patients who were fully oriented to time, date, and place would enter alternate realities where they were children or visiting other universes and speaking of these experiences to me out of context. But if I allowed myself to travel with them, again, it made a sort of sense. And finally, working with deeply psychotic individuals, I would be told of demons standing over my shoulder, urging my companions to do awful things. Despite not seeing these so-called hallucinations myself, I chose to enter into the realities my patients had. And had you ever walked by my office when a patient was in crisis, you might have seen the two of us yelling at nothing at all, at a wall, telling that spirit or vision or brain-induced hallucination to get lost. Perhaps therapist and patient appeared mad, but it connected us, conquering a foe that was unseen for me, seen for them, and all too real. Other patients spoke in metaphor, of a day at the beach, for example, when they were feeling safe. If I joined in the metaphor, that was always out of context and decoded seemingly nonsensical language, there was always a connection to be made. For me, working with people, nonsense made sense in a strange but familiar way. When Lisa suggested the creation of research into the communications of the dying, or RICTI, she was blazing a new path. I've listed here Callanan and Kelly, whose book Final Gifts explores from a narrative, but not controlled perspective, what people say as they die. Osis and Haraldson did research from an empirical perspective on medical providers' experiences with the dying, as have others. And Lisa has been collecting and analyzing words captured by loved ones at the bedsides of the dying, but no one, I repeat, no one has done what we are about to do. I also want to add that the definition of research from an academic point of view and as articulated by the University of Maine is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. While it may be true that discussion of deathbed language is common in hospice and hospital hallways, there has been no formal study of these processes to truly suggest correlations between a few key variables and the words of the dying. As I teach my students in research methods, we are endeavoring to avoid journalistic, folk, or common anecdotal assumptions and move toward exploring this phenomenon in a controlled environment, as controlled as we can create right now, to begin to formulate an evidence base. What we are looking at here is beginning a process of exploring the words of the dying in a very limited environment by examining just a few variables at first, in hopes of creating more expansive studies that will eventually allow us to create generalizable knowledge. We must acknowledge our limitations, and as good researchers we will, but this is a study that needs to be done. Which is recording, categorizing, and analyzing the speech of the dying to better understand linguistic patterns and psychological themes at the end of life, also known as, you want to do what? We get that a lot. And Lisa got that a lot. And people shied away from her project out of fear of death. And she couldn't find a home for her research project until Bryn Athyn College came along. Just under a year ago, I traveled to Athens, Georgia, to meet a woman who was formerly a stranger and is now a co-investigator and cherished friend. We spent 3 days intensively creating an initial protocol that scientifically analyzed the words of the dying. And oh yeah, I got to meet one of my biggest heroes. There I am getting my first photo op with Raymond. I can't believe I get to use his first name. Our protocol is revolutionary and methodologically very detailed because of the sensitive subject nature, but it's the first of its kind, uniting linguistics, philosophy, medicine, psychology, and spirituality. More importantly, and with great feedback from our review board, we have endeavored to include family members and loved ones at almost every step of the way, acknowledging that dying is still very much an intimate process that includes significant others who need to be informed and advised. Here are some of our, interesting, our research questions. Here we go. Here are some of our research questions. Note that we are not seeking here to measure the transition into the afterlife, though Raymond hopes we might see in the evolution of language a way of charting what happens to consciousness as the physical body shuts down. As a researcher, I need to be open to the fact that we might find none of this means very much, but we might discover some very interesting things too. We are not doing parapsychological research here. We are classifying and categorizing the utterances of the dying, hoping to answer the above questions. I also want you to understand we're not looking at many details here because our team, as our school, is small. But we are beginning an exploration and investigation in the hopes of one day looking at any and all variables that contribute to our understanding of what people say at the end of life. And why is it important? And to whom? What are the benefits? Because people are still so afraid of death in so many contexts. We hope to train care providers to help accompany patients and loved ones on their journeys, as educators and death midwives, helping to make what can be a jarring and frightening experience less so. We hope families will be able to engage in metaphor and enter into the reality of the dying person if that person doesn't appear to be on the same plane as the rest of us, helping to broker bonds across the lifespan. And for academics, we're not just contributing to, but really pioneering an entirely new area of research and end-of-life studies too. So, how are we going to do it? This is just a very brief overview of a study that, while low-tech, is actually more complex than you might think. We will work within our community to identify potential participants who might be interested in helping. For now, we're only authorized to record language that happens in private home environments. So, if our participants are transferred to a hospital environment, we'll have to suspend recording until and if they return home. There are so many moving pieces and staff at the hospital that we want to pilot the study in a smaller, controlled environment where everybody at the bedside can also agree to be recorded. And even though this is very important, we're only analyzing what the dying say. We need to respect that the presence of a recording device can be confusing and that those deathbed words, often sacred, sometimes scary, may not always contain information a listener wants to hear. So for those reasons and more, in our pilot study, anyone whose voice is recorded must sign in and let us know they agree to be recorded. Once potential participants show interest in the study, we'll arrange to meet with them as well as key family members to discuss it. Through a very detailed, informed consent process, we will explain our methods and answer any questions that arise, and we will ensure that our participants know being in the study is entirely voluntary. They can drop out at any time without consequence. Our protocol discusses informed consent at great extent. Once enrolled, our participants who have agreed will be visited and spoken with, as well as their loved ones, on a weekly basis to check in. We'll also be looking at medical records to document diagnoses and medications, and we'll collect other types of information like age and other types of diagnoses and medications. That will help us understand, we believe, during the analysis process, if any of these variables are correlated with certain types of language at the end of life. Once the participant's healthcare provider informs us that he or she has entered the pre-active or active dying phase, which is an estimate that death is likely to happen anywhere from weeks to days, we will turn on our recording devices. It's important we start recording as early as possible in the dying process to establish a baseline for when language begins to change. We will orient as many loved ones as we have previously identified to the position of the device, and the participant will have designated a recorder, and this is a person in charge of the device, and they can also turn it off or on again, provided they tell us why, and there is, of course, an option to not tell us why as well. Again, this will create limitations in our analysis process, but protecting and respecting loved ones here is so important too. Signage and information explaining the study will be at the bedside. And this is really cool, devices are voice activated, meaning they will begin to record automatically in the presence of speech and turn off when there is silence. We'll check in every day with recorders until the participant passes away. We will have interns deployed to help with device management, and we will document everything scrupulously. Once our participants die, we will collect the device and begin the transcription and analysis process, according to a qualitative research approach called grounded theory. This approach emphasizes inductive as opposed to deductive reasoning, is holistic, immersive, and flexible. And we hope to create new theories by analyzing data, creating knowledge as it arises. We will look for commonalities between themes, often called a hermeneutic approach, and create categories. We will want to see if there are any consistent elements of language and psychological themes that arise, and we will have a team coding the data independently and then convening to discuss to ensure reliability. We hope to have initial findings, or at least some interesting follow-up information after the death of our first participant. We're expecting that this process will take about a year from data collection to analysis to submission to peer-reviewed journals, but we will be providing updates throughout this time. Here's who will be involved. We'll need a small army to do this research, and we hope the core of it will be comprised of Bryn Athyn College students and graduates. Our academic program has already prepared future interns for this type of rigorous approach. I've been asked by so many what we need in order for this project to begin. I'd like to ask for your help tonight with donations, as while the project is small, there will be expenses. We would love for community members to take ownership of RICD too. And we would love for anybody willing to bring participant flyers available in the lobby to potentially interested participants or facilities. And of course, join our conversation by talking about language at the end of life. Talk to us, and please stay to ask questions. We've already been so wonderfully supported here by our president, Mr. Brian Blair, who has believed in the potential of this research. Our chief financial officer, Mr. Daniel Allen, for helping to arrange a smooth process for donations. Our masterful marketers, Serena Sutton and Holly Adams, and so many who have helped make tonight happen, publicist Ann Cookie Biggs, event planner Allie Smetanic-Childs, videographer and tech director Stuart Farmer, the awesome Swedenborg Foundation, Matt Childs, and host Curtis Childs, and our family and friends. This pilot study could lead to larger sample sizes and a number of methodological variations, namely by stratifying according to, for example, spiritual approach, diagnosis, gender, and so on. I was recently even contacted by a scientist, Sarah Bailey in North Carolina, who suggested we record blood oxygen levels and see if language and changes in language are related to these. I would love to see this. I'd love to see cross-cultural samples and to even explore final words of different languages. But for now, we'll be happy if we get even 5 participants. Thank you so very much for being here. I would be happy, delighted, honored, and privileged to answer your questions later on. Thank you.
My great-grandfather stretched out his arms and said, "Wait for me, Daddy, I'm coming home."
Good evening. Since we've been going a little over time, I suggest, since we just have 2 short presentations left of about 6 minutes apiece, why don't we just take a stretch break for about 15 seconds? Sound good? Then we'll close it off with just my presentation and Jonathan Rose's. Then we'll have the intermission. So yeah, stretch. People online can stretch too. Yeah, that's good. Oh yeah, work out the kinks. There we go. Okay, we're almost there. So I'm going to speak about intelligibility, assumptions, intentions, literalism, and hermeneutic background. Intelligibility and unintelligibility are dependent on our assumptions and intentions, as well as the assumptions and intentions of others. Here is an illustrative example. One Sunday morning, a preacher told his congregation, "Everyone who wants to go to heaven, come on down to the front of the church." And the whole congregation came forward, except for one man at the back. Thinking the man had not heard him, the preacher repeated his invitation. Still, the man remained seated. Finally, the preacher went back and asked the parishioner, "Don't you want to go to heaven after you die?" The man replied, "Oh, when I die." "I thought you were getting a group ready to go right now." So in the case of the afterlife, we can assume that only biology or physics makes something intelligible. We can assume that events occur only within natural time and natural space. But I encourage us to recognize that these are assumptions, that we can choose to make or not make. Most people make the transition between understanding something literally and figuratively so easily that they're usually unaware of its occurrence or how often it occurs. Normally, we intend to connect with other people and so are eager to make sense of what they say and write. For example, here is a magazine article that is designed to help people discover hidden health problems by noticing seemingly innocent bodily functions. This is perfectly normal interpretation of the title. However, when we take it literally, we find a contradiction. For two of the potentially deadly symptoms are snoring and coughing. And of course, these are anything but silent. But there is a use in being literal. We want our pharmacists and our electrical engineers to be very literal-minded on the job. And philosophers and other academics are sometimes trained to be literal-minded. So it has its place in the vast global organism that is intellectual inquiry. Yet literal-mindedness can be taken too far or misapplied. Imagine if every time you said, "Love is in the air tonight," someone rejected your observation by stating, "No, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are in the air tonight." This brings me to two quotations from Emanuel Swedenborg. In contrast to literalism, this first quotation from Arcana Celestia, or Heavenly Secrets, asserts that a person who directs his attention to the sense of the words a speaker uses does indeed hear his words, but in a way, he doesn't hear them. Instead, it is normal for us to grasp only the sense of them. In the second quotation, Swedenborg explains how our minds have both an exterior that links us to the natural world and an interior that links us to the spiritual world. Note that it is not only through analytical things that the natural part of the mind communicates with the rational part of the mind and thus the spiritual world, but also through analogical things. And this is a form of non-literalism. Now, hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, and what is in our background affects our ability to make sense of something. For example, if you watch the Bollywood film Amritsar to LA, you might understandably conclude that it was just another typical rom-com travel story that takes place in one city in India and another in America. However, if you watch the same film, knowing that it is also sold with the title Bride and Prejudice, and moreover, knowing that this is based on the book by Jane Austen entitled Pride and Prejudice, why then you would interpret the dialogue, specific scenes, characters, and indeed the entire film in a different light, and thus derive a much different and richer meaning from it. Speaking of hermeneutic background, in the book 100 Names for Love, Diane Ackerman explains and examines the aftermath of her husband Paul West's stroke. As the writer worked with a series of speech therapists, he would utter words such as smurd, grap, looch, when asked to name the object pictured in front of him, a broom. The therapist would tell Paul that his words were nonsense and then give him the correct word. However, when asked to name a telephone that was pictured, he said tesseract. His wife, having a highly literate background, knew that this was not nonsense. Instead, it was a very clever application of a word that means a three-dimensional object unfolding into a fourth dimension. Paul said that due to his strokes, quote, words come like tardigrades for him, which again is not nonsense, for tardigrades is a real word. Yet if we don't have this biological term in our background, or if we lack the concept of simile, then we interpret his communication as unintelligible. Okay, audience, you ready? Let's see if your speech is intelligible or unintelligible. Next slide, please. There we go. So this is a picture of okay, this is an interesting response. So if you said angels, then your answer was correct according to the speech therapist. Paul West said it was a picture of cherubim. But that word was not part of the speech therapist's hermeneutical background and was therefore incorrect and unintelligible. My hope is that this new project will help people become aware of these kinds of assumptions that they bring to communication with the living as well as the dying. Thank you very much.
A few days before my grandmother died, she said to my aunts and uncles, "Can I go home now?"
So here are a few thoughts, friends, on the mechanism that underlies this from the perspective of the Bible and Swedenborg's spiritual experiences. Manuel Swedenborg was born in 1688, died in 1772 at 84 years old. When he was in his mid-50s, he reports that he had an intense spiritual awakening that led to a more or less permanent dual consciousness of this life and the life after death. From his perspective on both sides of the veil, he was able to use his highly scientific mind to explore and describe in great detail the nature of the interaction between spirit and flesh. Now, people who think from a materialist perspective may find it difficult to believe in the near-death experience or out-of-body experiences because if the physical senses have shut down or are elsewhere, where else could the signals be coming from? And how might that perspective view people saying strange things as they approach death? That's probably just babbling as the brain is breaking down. The Bible expresses a different perspective. It says that we each have two bodies. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul speaks of our resurrection at death and what kind of body we have after we pass on, and his teaching culminates in this statement: there is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. Scripture is so obscure, isn't it? Putting this together with Swedenborg's experience, what I believe this is saying is that we have a physical body with physical senses and organs, and we also have a spiritual body with spiritual senses and organs. And we've had both since birth, although most of us are aware of only one of our bodies. The Bible also suggests that our spiritual body lives in a higher world, a world that contains wisdom that cannot be expressed intelligibly in the words of any earthly language. Again, Paul writes of someone, and everyone thinks it was him, who was, quote unquote, caught up to the third heaven. He was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words. And 17 centuries later, Swedenborg's experience confirmed what Paul said. Swedenborg declares that there are two complete worlds, a physical world of matter and a spiritual world made not of physical matter, but of what Swedenborg calls spiritual substance, meaning that it stands behind or under matter. I recommend his book, Heaven and Hell, to you if you'd like to explore this some more. These two worlds are completely separate, but each of us bridges and inhabits them both through these two bodies of ours, although many of us are not aware of that second world. Can I have the next slide, please? There we go. And I think the one after that, right, with the two people in it? Thank you. There we go. Our physical senses pick up physical signals from the physical world, and our spiritual senses, when they become active, pick up spiritual signals from the spiritual world, the world of the afterlife. As long as our physical senses are operative, they tend to command our attention. They are by nature louder and closer to us than the realm of the spirit, just the way the light from the sun during the day, being closer to us, overpowers the quieter light of distant stars, even though there are billions of stars, many of which are actually brighter and more powerful than our little sun. When we die, our physical body dies, and our physical senses with it, of course, but our consciousness comes into awareness of our spiritual body and its senses, and this provides a seamless transition of our consciousness when we die, the transition that people speak about in their accounts of near-death experiences. There are some people, though, like Swedenborg, who get an extensive sneak preview. For him, the veil between this world and the other one became thin to non-existent. And many people are clairvoyant or have other spiritual abilities, and all of us at times have vivid, lucid dreams or experiences that cannot be explained as merely physical. As people approach death, what I believe is happening is that signals from their spiritual bodies, which have long been drowned out by their physical senses, start to leak through. Does that make sense? The great division between spirit and flesh begins to break down for them, and as their physical bodies fail, their awareness of their spiritual body and spiritual senses begins to awaken, just the way the stars start to peek out as the sun goes down. Now, I've been trying to think, though, of a way to demonstrate this experientially for you.
Hold two.
I've been wondering how you could hold two experiences, hold two worlds in your mind at this. Excuse me for a minute.
Okay, next slide, go.
Oh, okay.
Ready, camera 3, and cut 3.
Okay, I think I know what that is. That's the person up in the booth who's calling the show. It's interesting when I think about it. It was very fortunate that happened because it's a good analogy for what I'm talking about. There's someone up in the booth there who's been running the show the whole evening. And even though we've been here paying attention to this and seeing slides and so on, we've been unaware of a second conversation going on in the same room. Unseen helpers, working behind the scenes, camera people, lighting people, sound people, have been getting a communication from a director in the booth, and none of us are aware of it. There's a second communication going on, and what I think happened there was that apparently the boundary between the two communications broke down for a minute, and that second conversation became audible. And the first, in fact, I started mindlessly saying, hold two, because I was, that's what I was hearing. I was echoing what I was hearing from the director up in the booth. So that's somewhat akin, I think, friends, to what I think is going on with people who are approaching death. They're starting to become conscious of a second conversation in another world, a conversation in an unseen world with unseen helpers working behind the scenes to get ready for the passing that is about to occur. And that conversation and many other things from that realm sometimes cross over into this reality through the mouths of those whose bodies are gradually failing. And their conversation might sound like nonsense to us. The language used behind the scenes is somewhat different than our language. For instance, none of us up here on stage tonight found occasion to say, ready, camera 3. But that doesn't mean it's not a language and doesn't have a purpose. Maybe we haven't heard such inexpressible wisdom before, and we're not sure what it means. So in conclusion, perhaps the next time you hear someone on their deathbed saying strange and wonderful things, you could think of it as offering you a glimpse of what they are experiencing behind the scenes. Thank you, friends.
I think back to my father when I was a baby, and my dad was delegated with the responsibility of singing lullabies to me at night. And when I was an infant, I couldn't tell you what my father was saying exactly and precisely, and oh goodness, he couldn't tell me what I was saying, right? I was gurgling and bubbling and all those things. But the language, the rhythm of it, the way that we connected formed a bridge between souls. 3 years ago, my father passed away, and during the last 3 weeks of his life, I heard a language and I heard a voice that often goes unheard by many of us. Sometimes, in some cases, the voices of those who are dying actually frighten the people who care most about them. After my father passed, and his final words were, "Thank you, I love you," to my mother, I went to the library at UC Berkeley. I'm a graduate of Berkeley in linguistics, to look up what I thought would be obviously there would be tons of research on this amazing language of end of life. And I looked through all the databases, I looked everywhere, and I found nothing.
When I was a kid, I was fascinated by Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and other nonsense writers. When I went to medical school some years later, I quickly realized that terminally ill patients tend to talk nonsense in the last few days or hours of their lives, and that the family members who are left behind are very touched by this and puzzled. I felt, therefore, that it would be a great thing to do to study the dying words, the enigmatic nonsense that people speak in the last few days and hours of their lives, and that with the typology of nonsense that I had developed, we're actually able to see the patterns of nonsensical communications people share in the last few days of their lives. So I am very happily working on this project with my friends, Lisa Smartt and company, because I do think that this is a very interesting and important piece of work that has never been done.
So interestingly enough, the Final Words Project is an amazing idea that involves collecting people's final words and analyzing what they say as they're dying. But Lisa Smartt didn't have an academic home for the project, and these days it's so important to have institutional review boards to oversee your research, and Bryn Athyn College happens to have an affiliation with a review board that would do that. Research into the Communications of the Dying, or RICD as we call it, is a project that falls under the umbrella of the Final Words Project. We're going to record those utterances and analyze from a linguistic and a psychological perspective what the words of the dying might mean. And this is groundbreaking work. There has never been work done like this anywhere before.
This, I think, can give us a sort of backhanded way into the human mind, and I believe that this work will be able to track the mind of people as we go through the dying process.
I really hope that the Final Words Project does many things. I hope it strengthens families. I hope it helps healthcare providers offer more compassionate care to the people that they're with. And I really hope that people are not so afraid of language that is different.
We are asking for your help in funding research into the communications of the dying. We want you to be a part of the process and to own a piece of our project. And the money is going to practical things like recording devices, like signs at the bedside that help loved ones understand what the project is about so that they don't have to be afraid or confused when they see a recording device at the bedside. It's going towards data analysis, my time as a professor, so that I can properly analyze and train interns, psychology interns, and even English majors who are looking at the elements of language so that we can train student volunteers to be a part of this research project, and ultimately this might lead to publications that they can have their names on too.
So I think that this is a very important project and that it's going to bring an entirely new kind of insight into the dying mind.
You can't be human and living without at some point experiencing the death of a loved one. And so this project applies to every human being in the world.
And what I really hope through the Final Words Project is as we understand the language of those final days and we understand it more deeply, that we can create almost like lullabies but goodbyes in those final days.
So, there's been a note made of it before. We've gone a little long. I see that as you get more value for the price of admission. There's scheduled an intermission now. Of course, anyone's free to go as they please, but in 10 minutes, we'll be back here, and our panel is going to be answering the questions that you've written down that we've gotten online. So if you want to see that, be back here in 10. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Rose, series editor of the New Century edition of the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. So maybe you've heard or read something interesting about this Emanuel Swedenborg, and you want to know more. Well, perhaps the most basic thing you should know, just for purposes of light conversation, is that Swedenborg was an 18th century Swedish scientist, philosopher, and theologian. Born 1688, died 1772. The next thing you should probably know is that he was brilliant. He was what people call a universal genius, a polymath, a Renaissance man, ahead of his time. For instance, he was a submarine designer before there was such a thing, a psychologist 140 years before Freud, an aeronautical engineer 190 years before the Wright brothers. He was a mathematician, geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, crystallographer, anatomist, botanist, chemist, physicist, cosmologist, astronomer. I'm not making this up, this is very well documented. He was an author, inventor, legislator, mining engineer, economist, editor, a poet, and a musician. He came up with the first rational design for flight and made anatomical discoveries that were well ahead of their time. He published 14,000 pages and left another 28,000 pages in manuscript. So he was one of those types. But perhaps the most important but also controversial thing about him was that he claimed that in his mid-50s he had a spiritual awakening that opened the afterlife to him while he was still alive in this world. He was not just alive, but functioning with indefatigable energy. You could think of him as having a near-death experience that went on for 29 years while he was living his daily life, seeing friends, participating in the Swedish government, and writing more books. After his spiritual transition, he wrote and published 25 volumes that contained 3.5 million Latin words. Why Latin? Because it was the equivalent then of English today. It was the most universal language at the time. He wrote and published with an urgency because he had a message for the whole human race. What he wrote draws on the Bible, reasoning, and his own spiritual experiences to present a refreshing take on Christianity and spirituality. His works give unique perspectives on the nature of God, the spiritual world, the Bible, the human mind, and the path to salvation. They've been a source of inspiration to many great thinkers and artists since. So where in all those volumes, that embarrassment of riches, is one to start? Here are 5 recommendations depending on what you're interested in. Heaven and Hell is Swedenborg's most popular book. It tells us what it is like to die. Swedenborg says the actual experience of death is a beautiful and peaceful transition, and all people are met and welcomed by angels. He says that world is more real than this one. There's a kind of geography of love in that world. Everyone is placed according to what they truly love the most. Our choices in this world and the state of our own hearts determine our eternal outcome there. Infants and children who die grow up into young adults there, while older folks grow younger and regain their health and vigor. Swedenborg gets into the language and writing and music in that world, what the homes and environments look like, and even how things look and sound and smell. Check it out. Divine Love and Wisdom is a book about the essence of things. In it, Swedenborg describes in detail the nature of the 2 fundamental properties of God, love and wisdom. He examines what might be called the philosophy of creation, including the goal behind creation itself, quote, an eternal union of the Creator with the created universe, end quote. He explores the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, asserting that in the way our sun brings light and heat to our world, we can see an image of how God's love and wisdom radiate throughout the spiritual world, bringing life wherever they are received. An unusual feature of the book is an extended look at the way the heart and lungs in the human body relate symbolically to the faculties of love and wisdom in the heart and mind. Divine Providence, despite being one of his shorter works, takes on what might be the most daunting challenge in spirituality, solving the so-called problem of evil. That is, reconciling the notion of a loving God that runs the universe with the existence of the evil, hardship, and suffering that so many have to endure. If God is truly all-loving and all-powerful, why aren't we all rich, happy, and living the life of our dreams? Swedenborg's response contains numerous insights, including the point that God is constantly acting with our eternal welfare in mind. Just as a young child with parents who take them to get a painful shot or limit their access to candy perhaps couldn't see the love behind these actions, it can be hard for us in life to discern which things are good, not just for our bodies, finances, and reputations, but good for our souls. Divine Providence is also something of a self-help book, showing what the individual needs to do in order to change inwardly. True Christianity, as the name might suggest, is Swedenborg's effort to correct, repair, and rejuvenate the Christian church of his time. Throughout his works, he often laments what he saw as the violent, divisive, condemning, empty nature of the Protestantism that held sway in much of Europe at the time, while simultaneously casting a grand, uplifting, transcendent vision of what organized religion could be. In this, his final book, he provides insights regarding the nature of God and of the Trinity, how and why Jesus redeemed the human race, the nature of the Bible, how faith and good works contribute to salvation, the true nature of repentance and how to practice it, and the second coming and the New Jerusalem. The tone of the work is often blunt and confrontational, and when it resorts to reducing opposing arguments to absurdity, devastatingly biting and witty. It's recommended for those with a particular interest in exploring Swedenborg's theological views and seeing the biblical support he offers for them. It also includes extensive accounts of Swedenborg's spiritual experiences. In the multi-volume work Secrets of Heaven, Swedenborg, in an unexpected, intriguing, and elegant way, offers a solution to what could be called the problem of the Bible. Although the Bible may well be the most widely circulated book on the planet, providing comfort, inspiration, and serving as a sacred text to millions, it has come under fire, particularly recently, for its self-contradictions, the seemingly immoral actions committed by people and God, and its conflict with modern science. Swedenborg's thesis, spelled out in staggering detail over the course of 15 volumes, is that just as Jesus often spoke in parables, concealing a deeper meaning, the Bible itself holds a deeper spiritual meaning that deals not with warring peoples and travels through the desert, but with the struggles and journeys inside our own minds. The creation story in Genesis is not a six-day assemblage of the physical universe, but is the story of our rebirth, how God leads us from the dark, formless void of self-centeredness and materialism into a living, growing mindset where true ideas and altruistic actions thrive. Secrets of Heaven also includes accounts of Swedenborg's visions, his spiritual anthropology, specifically his descriptions of the spiritual states of the earliest people, and much more. It is truly an epic journey to take, and a bedrock on which stands much of the rest of Swedenborg's worldview.
There are two basic elements that everything else came from. You could call one love and let's call the other wisdom. Amor sapientia, if that works better for you. Or substance and form, or the good and the true. They initially emanate together, creating the shape of peace in the human mind. But if we block them out, we become hostile to our own kind. We all know what that leads to. We've all seen what that leads to. Everything's about getting things back together. Everything's about getting things back together. So these two great forces push out, but we each receive them differently. See, there's potential for conjunction, not that we have them incompletely. But where these two are two, they would rather be one. And when they do, we get to start the whole thing over when it's done. Everything's about getting things back together. Everything's about getting things back together. There are two basic units of consciousness that exist or can never be. There is the infinite, divine, and finite stuff like you and me. We do not do well when we're cut off from the source, and the source would love to reconnect, but the source can't use force. Some people would love to connect too, but love can't do it by itself. Let's take that stuff I said in verse 1 back off the shelf. Wisdom is knowing how and doing, and with both you're a reflection. You become a conduit for the source, which is the source of that connection. You get it? Everything's about getting things back together. Everything's about getting things back together. I want to go back in. Okay, breathe in. You are the human form. You are the lungs. This is what it looks like when one person breathes. This is what two look like. But when the human race breathes together, it looks like this. We pull in ideas like oxygen, gathering them through inspiration. In our lungs, the molecules are taken by blood cells to move out into the body. But on the grand scale, the red blood cells are the communicators, the authors, the educators, the content producers that harness this idea and carry it into the mighty, rushing flow of information. And then, boom! Everyone can get it. Every cell can tap into it and use those ideas to power their processes. Whether they're creating a selective barrier to let helpful things in and keep harmful things out, or maintaining the structures we depend on for support. Or trying to perceive what's really going on with the situation. And all the other billions of actions and projects that build on each other and interact and interconnect in the billions of different ways that every part contributes to the whole on a scale and with a volume that you and I can hardly imagine, let alone fully understand or comprehend. Okay, ready? Exhale. We expel the old ideas, things that are no longer needed or don't belong, or that we've replaced with something better. And it flows. People from all over the world, from every walk of life, get grabbed by passions to affect positive change, to improve the lives of those around them, and they pump it out through networks, through organizations, spreading that passion to others who have the know-how and the means. Those with power build amazing things. And they're fed by people who have an unsatisfiable hunger to learn. How can we make this process quicker, cleaner, better? It's the most amazing machine that exists, but it's a delicate balance. Because a bloodstream that can so elegantly transport good ideas can just as easily transport bad ones. Some units aren't working for the good of the body, are stealing from the body, taking advantage or taking control. Is cancer anything other than cells that pursue their own growth at any cost and without limits, without any thought about the whole. But we fight back, closing ranks to heal the parts that have been damaged and clean out disease. And then the hands and muscles build so now the eye can see farther than ever. And then the optic nerve makes it so that what the eye sees, everyone sees. Lets us see something so far away. And then the heart lets us see what's so close. Okay, breathe in. When the whole body, every part is working together, we call that health. But when everybody's doing their part in the great body, every single person contributing to the whole so that we all benefit, so that everyone's discoveries, patience, lessons learned, hard work, and examples of love lift us all up. When every little part of every cell is feeding from the whole and giving back to the whole, when there's health for the whole human race together as one complex, immense, intimate, interdependent system, we call that heaven. I start with the atmospheres that the blessed live in, which are made of light, because they rise out of the light there. The number of different kinds can't be counted, and they are so beautiful and pleasant that they can't be described. There are diamond-like atmospheres that flash in their most minuscule elements, as if they were made of diamond pellets. There are
All right. Thanks for coming back, everybody. All right. Thanks to our panelists for all that great wisdom. So we're going to get into a few of the questions that y'all had. Beginning with, there was one I really wanted to start with. Yeah, this, because I feel like it sort of sums it up. What was the most amazing nonsense you have heard? And Raymond, do you want to open on this one?
I absolutely do. Is this working? Good. I have two wonderful grown sons, 44 and 41, and a wonderful son. And also, my wife and I have adopted two wonderful kids at birth, Carter, who's now 17, and Carol Ann, who is 14. And Carter is Mexican-American by heritage, and we adopted him from Kerrville, Texas. And Carol Ann is Native American Blackfeet from Montana. She's 14 now, and we adopted her at birth as well. Well, when we adopted Carter, the way we did it, we'd made contact with a Mexican-American family in Kerrville, Texas, just wonderful people, and their daughter, Carolina, was pregnant, and we made a contact with them. We went down there before Carter's birth, and we made good relationship with the family, which we still have. And then we went back for Carter's birth, and we were there when he was born on July 20th, 1998. And the obstetrician delivered him and handed him to my wife. So he has been ours from the very beginning. And we've also maintained this relationship with his wonderful birth family. And of course, there's the routine 3-day stay in the hospital after a baby is born, right? So on the day when he was 3 days old and we could take him out of the hospital, my wife and I and Carter went to a restaurant there in Kerrville, Texas, along with Carter's birth mother and her wonderful father and her mother. And we were all sitting around in this restaurant having lunch, and I was sitting there, my wife was sitting there, Carter was in his little carry-on seat. And the gist of the conversation was that Carter will always know about his birth family, and that in the passage of time, we'll all get back together and so on. And in the midst of this conversation, I looked up on the wall of this restaurant, and there was a placard there that was placed there for humor, and I'm sure you've probably seen the placard yourself. And this is what the placard said: "Closed. I have gone out to find myself. If I should arrive before I return, please hold me till I come back." Now, to me, that was Carter's thoughts. And 4 years ago, April of 4 years ago, it came to pass, just as Carter, just as this sign had said. Carter's birth family came, his mother and his biological father. Subsequently, they've gotten married, and her parents were there, and there was that reunion. And I just, that shows to me that sometimes at least nonsense can convey a transcendent meaning
because that was exactly Carter's message at that point.
Does anybody else want to speak to that? You try to top that? Okay. This is a question for Lisa Smartt. People near death often spend time asleep or nearly asleep. Do you think it would be useful to collect the utterances of healthy people when they talk in their sleep? This could be used to identify what is unique in the speech of those who are dying.
Yes.
That,
That's a wonderful suggestion.
does anybody
Thank
want
you.
to elaborate on that?
This thing is on. Okay. I think it's interesting when you speak with people about their experiences. People that have had spiritually transformative experiences often discuss the modality of sleep taking them to different dimensions, or that sleep was the gateway by which they were able to have experiences with deceased loved ones and after-death communication. So if you speak with someone that's had this type of experience, they'll say, you know, I fell asleep, but when I was with my loved one, I wasn't asleep. I was very much awakened in their presence. And I think, you know, again, what we're doing with this methodology is describing and analyzing. So I think it would probably be an interesting extension of the research to see if there's any language when someone's in that hypnagogic state when they're kind of waking up and a little bit groggy, and see if the language yields anything interesting. It's a great idea.
As a matter of fact, it's very common in the hypnagogic state for people to hear little pieces of nonsense. And this is the standard book on hypnagogic state is by Andreas Mavromatis, and it's called Hypnagogia, and it's a very, it's a huge book about, and this is what they talk about in there, that it's very common for people in the entry into sleep process, but the state between wakefulness and sleep, to hear nonsense going through their head. And it's also when people talk in their sleep, very often they talk nonsense. And it's indicator, and how many of you, for example, in your hypnagogic state, in that sort of twilight zone going into sleep, have that experience if you've heard nonsensical things? And again, if you look around the room, you see this is just very common. And in nonsense is also signifies transitions, as you would say. It's, for example, in shaman songs, as you can learn from Eliada's sort of classic on shamanism by Princeton University Press, 1964, if you want to look it up. But he talks about shaman songs, which in the shamanic tradition, it was a way of the certain group of the Siberian shamans said, we cross over to the other side by the power of our songs. But what this meant was that they felt that by uttering shaman songs, that they could pass over to the other side. And the structure of a shaman song is a blending of elements of meaningless nonsense, specifically nonsense syllables and meaningless refrains, together with elements of intelligible language so that the combination is more powerful than either alone, which sounds so abstract until you listen to this. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one and down it ran. Hickory dickory dock. Okay. Now, all of us know this. We passed it on for hundreds of years to our kids. What happens if you take out the nonsense? The mouse ran up the clock struck one and down he ran. Would you tell that to your kids? No. It's the power of the meaningless and the meaningful elements brought together that creates the mind-altering property of nonsense. And that was the mechanism of a shaman song. I used to, doo-wop has the same feature. And back in 1969 to 72, I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University, and to show my students in my logic courses the way that nonsense and meaningful utterances can get combined, I would take had a portable record player, and I would bring doo-wop songs to my students and play them. And since I was at the front of the room, I could watch the students' faces and expressions as these different kinds of doo-wop songs were played. And the first thing I said, it's very dramatic, and any of you could do this. I mean, it's just an easy thing to do. I quickly realized that the effect of the song depends on the specific arrangement of the intelligible versus the unintelligible parts. And there was one in particular that really I could see it would quickly put students into a trance, and it's called Little Star, if you want. And it's a very particular arrangement of nonsensical and meaningful parts. And I would just watch this. When I would play this, the students would just go right down into a trance very quickly. So it's a very powerful modality that we have forgotten about, although our ancestors in prehistoric times knew all about it. But once the literal domain was, distinguished and contrasted with the figurative and so on, and because of the historical things I was talking about, we've just sort of shuttled that aside, largely due to one of my heroes, Aristotle. But it's easy to bring it back into our awareness.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. So we heard some accounts of these already. Lisa, you mentioned what your father had said before he died. So we may not have anything on this, but somebody asked, what have been some dramatic personal changes you have seen in people's last moments? Does anyone on the panel have any stories being around somebody?
One of the research questions we're looking at is, do people die as they lived psychologically? And so I don't know, in the transitions I've seen of patients, that to me anecdotally has been confirmed. I actually haven't seen all that much drama. I haven't seen these kind of deathbed repentances or people running, screaming from the room. It's been a very natural transition many times when I've been in the presence of both children and adults. In fact, children more so, as difficult as it is to discuss. Children are innocent and authentic, and abiding with that was a very powerful experience because it was so non-dramatic and often very peaceful. And so I don't know if Lisa would feel any, or if you saw in your dad, but this, despite the words being different, and despite him accounting for angels and things like that, he still was who he was. It was still his voice and his personality coming through. So I might argue, and this again, all it is theories to be validated, I might argue that we might not see anything very dramatic at the bedside. I will say there are accounts of people having some fairly frightening NDEs and communications, but in my personal experience, I haven't seen that yet.
All right, thanks. Now, I'm sort of maybe thinking of you two guys at the end, but anybody who wants to answer this, go ahead. How do you think these conversations with the dying can help people resolve their fear of death? And if anyone else has thoughts on it, yeah.
I was talking with someone a few months ago who was dying. He had almost gone a couple of times and then come back, and I remember him talking about. It was a February morning when I went over there. It was very icy, and I was not in a great mood, and I had just planned on sitting in the sort of antechamber. He was in this hospital bed, but we walked through the door and we were just right in his presence there, and so there was no, it was like, okay, all right, we will, it was somebody I knew fairly well, but it wasn't a member of the family or anything. And he was so full of life and so much happier than I was in that exchange. It was really interesting, dying of congestive heart failure, I think. And one of the things that he said was, I used to think I was living to die, but now I think I'm dying to live. And he talked about what a happy time it was. He really somehow conveyed with his language to me that it's a transition, and that actually care is taken about this like you already got one foot, as other speakers said tonight, in that other realm, which I think is very gentle, and he seemed so happy about it. He was thrilled, and I felt the same quality in some of the things that Lisa quoted tonight, of sort of being thrilled or excited and moving forward. So I think it does help to remove that fear, which is pretty profound. I mean, we're all going to face it. We have no idea what it's going to be like, but I think it does take some of the edge off it. It certainly took some of the edge off it for me to see this person in such a radiantly happy state, having almost died a couple of times.
Yeah. I think it's on if you just try it.
Okay, if I may comment. The example you used there is another example of how the incidence of repetition figures of speech increases as people get closer to death. And the specific one there that he used is called chiasmus, and it involves repetition in reverse. Like when you say, as Cicero, or Tully, as we call him, Cicero, said, eat to live, not live to eat, and many others. And it's a very complex figure of speech, and it's interesting that would be the one he would choose as,
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit to that. Was having a discussion with my brother-in-law, and both getting older, and we noticed that we had something of a fear of how we might die. Would it be a painful exit, or a sudden one that would, bring unexpected grief to our loved ones? But we felt that the more we read about people and their experiences, and contemplated it, that the idea of dying actually became less fearsome. And particularly as we have relatives who pass away. We have an aunt that passed away fairly recently, and she was an international traveler, and some months before she passed away, she was declining, and she made the comment to us. She said, "Well, I have one foot in the departure lounge right now." And she was looking forward to going. She missed her husband, who had passed away some years before. And something that Raymond and our researchers are doing here is that it goes back to, Raymond has a strong affection for ancient philosophy. And philosophy is the love of wisdom. And one of the things that philosophy and psychology, the logos of the psyche or the soul, is supposed to do, it's supposed to help us reflect on how our life will end, so that we can better live our life now. It's like that exercise that maybe sometimes you have your students do about, what do you want people to say about you at your memorial service? And so thinking about your own demise actually helps you live a wiser life now, before that time. And I think maybe some of the things that we might hear people say in their final words, some of that might give us some wisdom in that regard. Particularly if it does turn out that people tend to die or make a transition as they lived, and so we might see, how important habits are, for example, in our lives.
I think we're going to have two more questions. One, this is one of several questions. Somebody talking about an experience that they had. My father would call my name when I would leave the hospital room. Did he need me back? And so I'm assuming this is the father's near death, and not necessarily lucid, but would call the name. So maybe you don't know definitively, but does anyone have thoughts on that? Or did I stump you?
Well, I know that a proper name is, incidentally, I happen to have written my doctoral dissertation on the problem of proper names, and that sounds so bizarre until you realize it's a very difficult part of speech for logicians. And the reason is that we know about the distinction between denotation and connotation. The denotation of a term is the class of all objects to which it can be truly asserted. Like the definition, the denotation of dog would be Fido and Rover and on and on and on. But the connotation of a term are the characteristics that are conveyed when you assert the word of the object. And the difficulty with proper names, why they have been of such great interest to logicians, is that they apparently have denotation without connotation. It's like if I say Bill, you may be able to infer because of the conventions that the person is probably a male, but you can't really, I know a Bill who's a woman, and so it's interesting, and it's a very powerful mode of expression. And so to me, if I were in that situation, and then I heard that somebody that I loved was calling my name, I would take that very seriously. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I also wanted to suggest, though, that as Lisa has mentioned, there are lots of metaphors that arise at the end of life. So perhaps the symbolism of that name is important. It's if a father is calling a child's name, most rationally, yes, there would be a yearning for that child, but also what that son represents, and perhaps the connection, the mental mapping of memories and sweet things and hard things, and perhaps that child plays a role in transition. So I would hate for that person to feel guilty and not feel they could leave. This is why we're doing this research, right? We want to comfort people. We want to also provide an evidence base for this kind of stuff. And I would hope that that person wouldn't feel guilt or that they had missed something, because it's quite possible that in saying the name and the repetition of the name, that brought that child closer to that parent. And so even without the child having to be there, there was a sense of just calling them and summoning them forth in that dying state. And I would hope that they might be comforted by that.
Leads well into the last question, because you said this is what we're trying to do with the research. So this can be for anyone, but so in what ways can or do near-death studies and what you're doing influence end-of-life policy making? So looking down the road, and it's hypothetical, but what could we possibly get out of this once we learn things? So, does anybody want to start that? Okay, we'll go back to you.
I think it's really interesting, having gotten, one of my degrees is this bioethics degree from Penn, and as technology has allowed us to extend our lives and keep us, our natural lives sustained, shall we say, it has created a host of questions or issues regarding, well, when does the person actually leave their bodies, and how do we get wishes from loved ones expressed? And one of the things that I'm thinking about a little bit is this idea of advance directives, how many people come into the hospital and they don't have their wishes written down. And so oftentimes when there is the discussion of life support, you have to kind of have your best guess as to what that person would have wanted. But of course, if you ask a significant other, what would your loved one have wanted? Oftentimes that significant other speaks for him or herself, what they would want or what they would want for that loved one. And that's understandable, that's human nature. But if we can start seeing where language deteriorates or starts being more unintelligible, if there are questions we can ask in a critical period, if there is, I'm almost thinking of Chomsky's critical period for learning language, is there a critical period where we start to unlearn and start to kind of go into nonsensical? And if that's the case, we can still try to have these conversations maybe later than we expected. I imagine a person who might be rambling and whose decisions might seem like they're not making sense, but if we can start categorizing and classifying, saying there's still some of that person in there and they can be involved in this end-of-life conversation and tell us what they want, I think that's valuable. I think it's a really hard thing to do right now. I don't think we're anywhere close to it, but we have these abilities to really add or remove interventions that affect how we die. And so we're going to be having more of these conversations. My other hope would be that we make this more of a family discussion, that when we have death happening in medicalized environments, as now is the case, we are not quite as communal as we used to be, where people died at home, although it still does happen, that we could bring families more together around the bedside and in the healthcare environment and appreciate the value that having a social aspect to dying brings. That's very nebulous with regards to policy, but I think we would have to start somewhere around there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got an opinion too, which I just think this is a good opportunity. Maybe I know there's probably a lot of people here interested in near-death experiences. So what I see in the medical community, having been the son of a medical doctor who, I was there at my dad's graduation from medical school. I've known all of his colleagues throughout their career. I've been a physician myself for almost 40 years. And what I see, having my interest in this subject awakened in philosophy because of its relevance to the study of ancient Greek philosophy, but I've seen the whole process of its gradual integration into medicine. And so it might be interesting for you to know that Missouri Medicine is a very highly ranked medical journal. I think there's 100 plus in the US, and the most respected, of course, is the New England Journal of Medicine. But I think the ranking of number 5 is Missouri Medicine, which is a very reputable and respected medical journal. And they have just finished an 18-month series of articles on near-death experiences by physicians who have either investigated it or who have had near-death experiences themselves. And clinically, the relevance of this doesn't have anything to do with the question of an afterlife, in the sense that the way this presents itself in medicine is that we know from many studies that this is a fairly common concomitant of the process of revival and resuscitation and so on. And it's getting more common because the resuscitation techniques are rapidly getting better. So we're getting more and more of these cases of people who are brought back from closer and closer states to states of death. And we see the experiences are getting correspondingly more complex as the closer they get to death. So this is a very important question clinically, because the clinical question is, what do we do for these patients? You know, what do you do when a patient has a profound, life-changing spiritual experience when they're in the medical situation? And so I think the answer to that is pretty clear, and that is that number one, you need to listen to them, because it helps people just to be able to narrate their story and to listen to them kind of non-committally, and to number one, and to reassure them that they're not alone, that you've heard this many times and that this is very well studied now. So it very much has a clinical relevance. And plus, another thing is that there are all kinds of other experiences that people have in the prospect of death that clinicians just need to know about. When I was an 18-year-old, I remember at UVA reading Plato's Phaedo, which is still, oh my God, what a work. And those of you who've read the Phaedo remember that when his friends go into the prison that day that he's to be executed, the first question they ask him is, Socrates, what's this that you've been writing songs while you're in prison? And the implication is here, maybe he's slipping under the stress, right? Because in the other works of Plato, Socrates is always portrayed as, poets are liars and we're not going to have them in the ideal society and so on. Why this change there at the last few days? And so Socrates says, well, I'm responding to dreams and visions that me to pursue music. So he goes, and he's been writing these songs, and then he goes on to make an analogy, or a metaphor. He says that the swans, there's a Greek folk belief that just before swans die, they sing the most beautiful songs at all. And Plato kind of speculates that, well, this is their way of attuning themselves to the other side, and that. So anyway, I knew that as an 18-year-old undergraduate. That was 1962. Flash forward to 1974. I was doing my surgery rotation, and so I and two attendings walked into this woman's room in her early 70s who had heart difficulties. And as we walked in, we saw her have the cardiac arrest. And so I was the first one there, so I started the resuscitation. Okay, and as this woman was passing away, she was reciting poetry.
Wow.
Okay. I didn't have the presence of mind. What was that again? And write it down, but I could tell it was poetry because of the meter and the rhyme. Subsequent to that, I have heard from hundreds of people who tell me that in the last few days or hours before their loved one died, that as far as they knew, this person never had any interest whatsoever in poetry or song, but the last few days, they started writing poetry, and sometimes, as they are dying, sing. Now, these are not nearly as common, say, as near-death experiences or shared death experiences, and in a group this size, probably one or two. But how many of you, it's probably not a big number, but how many of you have experienced that with your own life experience or anybody? Let's see if there's anybody here. 1, 2, how many? I see 2 hands. Is that all? And 3. Okay. And you see, these are things that anybody can observe if they just start asking, but are not generally known. And it's very mystery. Why in the last few days or hours do people who've never had any interest in poetry or song start singing or writing or reciting poems?
Let's end on that note. Everybody, thanks for hanging out for the extra hour. Thank you to our panel. Have a good night.